Hi, this is Trent England with Save Our States with another one of our 6 Questions podcasts. Thanks so much for being a part of our online audience, whether you're watching this on YouTube or listening on Spotify or Google Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcast. I think this is going to be a great episode. We are talking today with Jeff Nelson. He's the executive director and co-founder of the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. And it seems like maybe we need some cultural renewal, and also a former executive vice president at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, which is close to my heart because back when I was a college student over 2 decades ago, ISI was very helpful in supporting our conservative student newspaper, or really sort of a campus magazine that we published that was a lot of fun and even broke some news on the campus. So Jeff,
what paper was that?
That was the Claremont Independent out of Claremont.
Sure, yeah, that's a great paper, yeah. Oh,
yeah.
Terrific.
So Jeff, thank you so much for being on.
You're still breaking news, so we must have done something right in investing in you.
That's right. Well, when I was there, probably one of the best memories of my entire college career was having the late great Harry Jaffa feeding us information from the faculty lounge.
Feeding is probably about the right image too.
Yeah. He was a true agitator, and it was a lot of fun.
Those were the times. We'll talk about Russell Kirk, but Harry Jaffa, these kind of Buckley, these great figures, Frank Meyer, Whittaker Chambers, really amazing, kind of a eccentric, very individualist in the right sense of the word. They sort of walked the earth and populated the conservative movement. It made it so interesting and so important and such an intellectual force in our modern American intellectual history.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they laid an incredible foundation. The first question is directly to that. What is the Kirk Center? And obviously tell people a little bit about Russell Kirk, because many people today don't know very much or even anything about him.
Yeah. Well, if you call yourself a conservative, think of yourself as a conservative, are interested in conservative ideas, institutions, the history and tradition, you have Russell Kirk to thank for your identity. When Russell Kirk wrote his big book, important book, The Conservative Mind, in 1953, there was no conservative movement in America. In fact, all liberals didn't believe there was such a thing as a conservative tradition or could be an American conservative until his book came along and showed that, it was there have only been important American conservatives, but a long and illustrious tradition of American conservatives that in many ways predated even the American founding back into the colonial times and British Americans, and then moving forward to our contemporary time. It included all sorts of interesting people, statesmen, poets, journalists, writers, politicians. And when his book came out and demonstrated this, it was a massive explosion because liberals thought that, if you thought you were conservative, it was basically some kind of irritable mental gesture, as one of them put it, right? And not a serious tradition to be engaged with and to be thought of in a high level, as fundamentally a part of America as any other intellectual tradition. And so Kirk identified this in The Conservative Mind. And he kind of not just identified the tradition, he kind of gave us a way to think about it too, kind of conceived of it in a certain way through an imaginative, kind of presentation of history. So his was a powerful historical and imaginative mind. He was a literary figure as well. He wrote very famous ghost stories and Gothic novels, which he's highly regarded for as well. And so he kickstarted this thing and called the conservatism in America, the conservative movement, when Bill Buckley, William F. Buckley Jr., founded National Review and asked him to be a part of it at its origins. He called it a conservative review when a year and a half earlier he was planning to call it some kind of an individualist review, because individualism was the only word that we conservatives of that time kind of thought of as potentially a label for themselves. Collectivism was abroad. You obviously had the same kind of thing going on with the New Deal internally in America. So it was collective versus individualism. Kirk thought that was a false dichotomy. We're persons, not merely individuals. And surely enough, individualism in the 60s and late 50s and into the 60s became a prized term of the new left, very radicalized and relativistic. All this, obsession with choice. So Kirk is an extremely important figure for that regard in that area, that just merely giving us this whole idea of being a tradition, being conservatives in America, and an incredible, in just 50, 75 years afterwards, the institutions, the periodicals, the magazines, the thinkers, the scholars, this whole blossoming of conservatism in America that we think of must have been here for a long time, but is still relatively a very kind of new thing. So we owe a lot to Dr. Kirk for that. As well as we can talk, he was a prominent syndicated columnist. As I mentioned, he wrote ghost stories, and he was a very popular campus speaker. So he was just sort of everywhere in the conservative firmament until his death in 1994. But his legacy goes on pretty well. He's very well translated around the world. He's taught in most colleges and universities on syllabus dealing with American intellectual life, or classes on conservatism and liberalism. He's quoted or is the subject of magazines. What would Dr. Kirk think of this or that, or what is a Kirkian version of conservatism? What does Kirk's presentation of conservatism look like, and in regard to the contemporary discussions we're having today, and how might he shed light on it? Because when I say it's a big thing to say he identified a tradition, but and that's where it gets interesting, and people like Harry Jaffa would occasionally object. So I won't go too much more in the weeds, and just wanting to give your listener a sense that this is a very important person in their own sort of tradition to know about, because as I think we'll talk about time and time again, Kirk's big figure was Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke was the great British statesman and is the father of modern conservatism, intellectually speaking, overall. And he taught us that people will not look forward to posterity who never look backward to their ancestors. And that was a very important thought for Kirk, and all of us as conservatives, we're always trying to tease that out.
Yeah. So I want to dig into that just a little bit in a way that I think will be particularly useful for our listeners, which is to ask about Russell Kirk's books. Jeff, you were his assistant, even edited some of his books. Where should a person start if they're hearing this and saying, well, I've sort of heard of Russell Kirk, I've never read anything by him, I want to tap into the richness of our conservative tradition. So I mean, some of his books, The Conservative Mind is a hefty tome. It's over there on my bookshelf. I should have grabbed it before we started. Roots of the American Order, I think, is another big book, although I think it's very readable. But where should people start?
Well, there is a little book that came out a few years ago that was reissued. It's called Russell Kirk's Concise Guide to Conservatism. And it's, Regnery publishes it, Regnery Publisher. It's very available. The historian Wilfred McClay wrote a real nice introduction, which kind of sets it up. He just wrote a big book called The Land of Hope, which is, a new presentation of American history. And
he left us here in Oklahoma and went to Hillsdale.
Oh, I know. That's too bad. Well, Hillsdale just seems to grab everybody.
Yeah.
But so I think The Concise Guide to Conservatism, I would say The Politics of Prudence is it was his last book of essays, but he has kind of like, it's more Reddit like presentations of his thought. In other words, here's 10 conservative ideas, here's 10 conservative thinkers, here's 10 conservative issues, here's 10. So he kind of gives you lists, which a lot of people like, and they're substantive lists. They're interesting when you're going through his conservative principles. I mean, the first chapter one of the first chapters on the 10 conservative principles is very important. His chapter on the errors of ideology is very important too, because Kirk was somebody who believed that sort of an ideological cast of mind, you take any theory to hyper theory too far to two extremes, and that can happen on the right or the left, and becomes too reductionist. It becomes very dangerous and brittle. And so he's always aware of sort of conservatism as being, having a certain kind of variety, a sense of perfectibility of man, and ideas of kind of a sense of humility amongst and both intellectually and just in the sense of our own fallenness. So, but I think the Politics of Prudence, the concise guide, the Roots of American Order is a longish book in the sense of, it's 400 or 500 pages, but it is accessible, and it's a really nice read through the ways in which the American founders took from various civilizations a kind of ideas or inheritances that they made then into their own thing in Philadelphia. I mean, it's very image based, and we're an image driven society, and it's driven by the images of 5 cities. Jerusalem. What did the founders take from Jerusalem? What did they take from Athens, Rome, London, and then Philadelphia? Culminates in Philadelphia and the making of this extraordinary achievement, which is, in his view, the reconciliation of order and freedom in a constitutional arrangement and setup. And that's a great gift to mankind, and has made America sort of the greatest republic in the history of mankind. Now, preserving that is so important. And again, understanding how the founders saw and took as being important selectively from these civilizations, and then thinking about that not just at a moment in time in the founding, but what that means to us today. Still, very much still, we're historically impoverished, and yet our roots are very dry. They're attenuated, they're withering, and we need to water those roots. So the images all over that book, the figures, the thinkers, is a very exciting book and a presentation. So I would say that's the place to start, because that gives you the big tradition. That's conservatism as a civilizational project. America then is a particular experiment within that civilization, and conservatism, the tradition, is a way to think about those two, Western Civ and America within it, and what it is that we need to be working on to conserve that, to extend it to the next generation.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense to me, because when I think back about, sort of formulating my own ideas, I do think the Roots of American Order gives you a structure on which to, sort of build a lot of ideas and understanding about where these ideas came from, whether they're in the Declaration or the Constitution, or just a part of our culture. These
are great debates. I mean, look, one cool thing about it, and Dr. Kirk was part of this and knew it, and was, as what conservatives of this generation were very excited by, the most interesting and dynamic sort of intellectual debates in American history in the last 75 years have not been between conservatives and liberals. It's been between and among conservatives themselves. And there's just so much richness and pretty intense and interesting dialogue. You probably may remember that when you were a student, going back and, wow, I got to think about this school of thought and that school of thought. I'm at Claremont now, what do I think of that? And there's these libertarians that are out somewhere, and they're doing their thing, and there's these people who believe in tradition and continuity and moral order, and what's that all about? What are these journalists up to at National Review? Is this thing called fusionism really work? Is it a thing? Is it not? So, I mean, it's super exciting to be an American conservatism, and pretty boring to be an American liberal.
I think that's right. Yeah, I certainly learned never to skip the letters section of the Claremont Review of Books.
Yeah, no, don't do that.
So another question. You mentioned Russell Kirk writing fiction, and of course, Bill Buckley wrote fiction. C.S. Lewis wrote fiction. What is the connection between being a deep and productive thinker and writing fiction? I mean, and some of this is it's not these complicated modern novels. I mean, many of these are they're simple, sort of whimsical stories that these people have written as a part of their work. How does that fit in? Is there a connection, or is it just sort of?
I think it's one of the most central connections we can make, because the imagination is more powerful than reason. Just is. So we know that images, stories, our Lord knew that. He told parables, right? I mean, that's how he taught, through stories. Stories signify stories reaching Napoleon knew it. He said imagination rules the world. People who are creative and who can imagine and stretch things out, they're the seekers, they're seers. I mean, the abstract reason can be, as we're talking about, can be very limiting, and may mislead us. And so experience, imagination, these are other modes of knowledge. They are modes of knowledge. Reason, science are not the only way we know truth and reality. Many ways we can get to reality more analogically, more directly through the imagination. That's why Lewis knew that. I mean, Narnia, come on, he wrote all this great stuff, but it's Narnia he's known for, right?
Yeah.
And Buckley wrote, well, I like Bill a lot, but those aren't great. For him, I think that was just fun,
Yeah.
Cold War, stuff. But people did read them, and they did, sort of convey a sense of the drama of the Cold War and the West and the spy stuff, and he got that from Chambers too. And so he was doing his in his way, and then Kirk is doing it very interestingly through the arc of his own career, through his many short stories and his novels, which some of which are now being treated for potential Hollywood scripts. So I think, he too understood and thought. I mean, he would have liked to have wrote more fiction than nonfiction had he had the chance. It's just more fun, but I think it's also more satisfying, and I think that's one of the reasons we're a Center for Cultural Renewal. You mentioned the need for cultural renewal at the outset. This is an area where conservatives have talked about it for a long time. We have not done well in the arts. We really have not encouraged and supported imaginative fiction, painting, drawing, poetry, music. And I think we're doing a lot better in that, though. I feel like there's a kind of a revival, a renaissance in the conservative Christian space of all in these areas of literature and poetry and painting, even in music, and things happening in Hollywood. So I'm kind of bullish that this obsession with politics, politicizing everything, reducing everything to labels, all that, is giving way to a sense of probing for the deeper realities of the truth of the human condition and who we are. And to me, the imagination is the avenue. It's yeah. So I think that's the connection.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. The Wall Street Journal had a story within the last year or so about some social science research that they presented as sort of surprising that people who read a lot more fiction have a lot more empathy. And I thought that doesn't seem surprising at all, and rather, I think it seems in line with the understanding that you just described, that imagination is one of the ways that we know things about, especially things about other people. And I thought it was fascinating that to whoever, whatever young scribbler wrote the article for the Journal, they seemed very sort of confounded by the whole idea that reading fiction could really be valuable for life.
Yeah, and most conservatives understood this, the power of the imagination. I mean, and I think today there are conferences. I just saw a big conference, 2-day conference. It's going to be at Dallas. It's got incredible, really big lineup of musicians, poets, and novelists. Like 2.5 days full of AP publishers. Lots of stuff going on in our space. So. And I've seen, there's journals now, Scala Foundation with Margarita Mooney. Suarez is doing a lot of art things. James Matthew Wilson is getting a lot of attention for his poetry, and who was reading poetry 10 years ago, or 12 months ago. So, but they're getting a lot of action on social media. They're getting a lot of traction. So I think this is a good thing for conservatism, because we can't just be arid intellectuals. We have to really plumb the depths of our spirit and our imagination, who we are, and, as you say, transcend all sorts of boundaries. And I think this is the way. So find it very exciting, and it's interesting. Kirk's interesting because he's a founder in one genre, an area of modern American conservatives, a big political movement. He's considered a father. In another area, he's considered a father of the Gothic revival of Gothic fiction, the uncanny ghost stories. Stephen King, he was close, admires him. Ray Bradbury and he were close friends. Stephen Parnell, Jerry Parnell was big. Dean Koontz is a big popular writer now, is a massive Kirk guy fan and stuff. So he's always anthologized. Some people only know him as a guy who wrote uncanny stories and ghost stories and not the politics. And of course, it's usually the other way around. So when you get the mix going, it's really cool. It's
that's terrific. Well, you mentioned poetry, so I'll ask you a question about both Russell Kirk and T.S. Eliot talked about the permanent things.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, in our postmodern world, a lot of people, especially young people, are being told there are no permanent things. How do they recognize and make the case for the permanent things?
Well, you recognize them all around you every day, in institutions you work with or through, or the people, your schools that you're a part of, the churches that you go to. I mean, they're mediated, in those institutions mediate the permanent things for us. But we know that there are, well, I suppose as an intellectual endeavor, we can argue about universal truths and how you get there, and whether they're permanent or impermanent, or whether, we can, what we can know to the certain levels that way. But I think that as a matter of just kind of intuition and experience, going back to experience being our guide, we know through, we know what's true, which makes us happy, and we know what's works as a civilization and as a culture. And it is those kind of permanent things that working the families, the churches, the schools, civics associations, those are the things that, endure and that are so important to keep the continuity of our beliefs, practices, and institutions moving forward. And I think it's just kind of we introducing students to the right, or to thinkers that can kind of get them excited about it. But the romance of tradition, and Chesterton talked about the romance of orthodoxy. You want to love something, you want to love your country, you want, as Burke said, your country has to be lovely for it to be loved. We want it to be lovely, and we want to love it. And I think we want to love, those who are dearest to us. Well, obviously we do, and hopefully, and we, and our communities and our local being, we find a lot of the permanent things in the local, not in the national or the global. So sort of turning our heads back to the garden that's, right around our corner or in our backyard, as opposed to dreaming about how other perfect gardens can be formed somewhere else and somehow else. Just being content with and excited about what's around us and what we can do to renew culture and renew the permanent things and reinvigorate them. Because you're right, sometimes they're easy to take for granted. Permanent things, kind of a vague term, so you have to kind of bring it down a little bit, and also just to talk to students about what it means to be a conservative and to conserve institutions, to reinvigorate, to renew, to cultivate. These are all kind of conservative ideas, and it's the permanent things that we're focused on. So I think I don't think it's an easy just come in, sit down for the classroom, and couple hours we'll work through this together. But I think being a model, having exemplars, and really seeing that those institutions that are close to you, that belong to you, that are mediating these permanent truths that are so important to you and your life moving forward, and showing kids maybe just a couple practical ways of how they can get involved and make a difference, and to love those better, and to be excited about what they see as a result.
I'm talking with Jeff Nelson. He's the executive director and co-founder of the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. Jeff, here at Save Our States, obviously we defend the Electoral College, and it goes right to the heart of, I think you mentioned, talking about Russell Kirk's book, The Roots of the American Order, this conflict that people sometimes see between freedom and order. There's a conflict between democracy and the rule of law, and we find ourselves at the intersection of that oftentimes.
For sure.
How do you explain that, right? Especially in the face of all this political rhetoric about democracy. Everything's supposed to be democracy. We know, I mean, anyone who values the Bill of Rights knows that they don't actually want to be ruled by just pure direct democracy. That's not a form of government that's ever been successful, but people talk that way. It's become a sort of a casual way to attack things in the Constitution and otherwise that people don't like. So how do you defend this constitutional order that both allows and restrains democratic majorities to get what they want?
Well, at the Kirk Center, what we do is we defend it through education. We defend it specifically through historical education. And then you can, from there begin to defend it through the sort of the ideas that inform the historical conditions and debates and arguments and institutions that emerge, and try then not just to look at it as a mere thing of the past, but also as something that teaches us in the here and now, because we're, these, like as you mentioned, and certainly it's true with the Electoral College. This has been a never-ending discussion, it seems like, in our history, between these two polarities. Democracy and what kind of republic we are or aren't. So I think we live in a very difficult time to make some of these arguments, because, well, there's the social media, the things we know, the way communications works, the degradation of the American educational system is just devastating. But I think we have to find ways through institutions and programs like Save the States and others, where you can do, like I mentioned just a minute ago, where in the place that you're at, the garden you're in, you're given your mission, we all can't do everything. We have to have a healthy division of labor if we're going to, between groups and institutions, if we're going to turn this around. And so we each do our part, and we do it very well and effective. Hopefully we'll reach these new generations and focus less on abstract stuff and more on, like, let's get you thinking about history. We do a lot, obviously. Here we teach American conservatism. It's the Russell Kirk Center. They come to learn what it means to be an American, what it's meant to be an American conservative, what it means to be an American conservative. And we do that through all sorts of ways, but the historical orientation is really key for us. And it's really striking because of what we can get on policy questions or some journalistic or some debate on Twitter, or and the students will light up and they'll talk. But if you start talking about a little bit about the roots of American art, well, let's go to Athens and say, what is this tradition of reason? Where does it come from? Blah, blah. Or even, you start at this layering in some historical education. The question and answer just dry up. They don't know how to think, even historically, or what I don't know what to make it. So this is a kind of a big challenge. Having said that, Dr. Kirk would always say near the end of his speeches, he'd go about 80% that the world is falling apart, and then he'd stop and say, well, now it's time to let a little cheerfulness break through. And so if you want a cheerfulness to break through, I would say the other thing I see, and you probably see as well, is this incredible explosion. Really, I mean, it's homeschooling been going, but now the explosion of classical schools and all these new networks, these Chesterton schools or Great Heart schools, charter schools. There's every kind of school out there, crazy. And there's colleges now that are, were homeschool colleges that are kind of growing out of that, but still doing that very well. And those students are amazing. I mean, their historical literacy, they study past languages, the languages of Greek and Latin. Well, in doing that, they also study the civilization. Oh, in doing that, they start reading the American founders, and they see Latin and Greek all over the place.
Yeah.
Look at the Great Seal of our nation. It's like layers upon layers of historical roots of American order education. And they get it, and they're just proliferating. And I think that is the future. And if we can keep feeding that fire, getting those kids through and to their place where we're at, 10, 15, 20 years from now, we're going to be a much better, much healthier movement. So I'm very bullish on the longer term, believe it or not. I'm not, the present, getting through the present is a little bit of a struggle.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't have an intern program anymore at Save Our States, but when I used to be involved in hiring interns for the Heritage Foundation and a couple of other think tanks, and it was remarkable, the difference. And I hope that students out there, parents, grandparents, really paid attention to what you just said, because the difference between the students who came out of the kind of programs you're describing, Hillsdale being one, but Hillsdale not being the only one anymore, which is really important.
You're only talking about 1,000 kids at Hillsdale. We need a lot more than that.
Yeah, no, that's right. But the difference between those students and almost all of the rest. I mean, certainly you could find some who were self-educated and yet had gone to some sort of ordinary school, but no, it was shocking. And we certainly, that does give you a glimmer of hope when you see these students out there who have sought out for themselves, because you don't fall into it anymore.
And they're being recruited by the mainstream.
Yeah.
Now, the high school kids from all these variety of classical, homeschool, whatever, these independent college, high schools. They're being recruited into the top colleges, Harvard, Yale, Virginia. They're all recruiting them. All the law schools and the graduate schools are recruiting them. So they're moving into those places. They're not just going to the Hillsdales or the Grove Cities or the Thomas Aquinas, whatever. They're going there, and they should. Like you said, they're amazing. But they can also find their way. They're so well grounded, and that's the thing. When to say, I guess, about the order, when you are able to teach them that what the founders about was a very difficult project. It was about reconciling the tendencies of order and freedom. Reconciling is a key word. That's an art. It's not such a science. And you have to think, you have to know, you have to have experience, you have to have prudence, moderation. So I think in the best sense, and these students kind of get that, and they're able to get through even the crazy schools and get the right degrees, and they're moving out. So I think that as they move into institutions and stuff, that they're the future. And look, let's face it, demographically, that's a good thing too, because they're having more, that those kind of parents are having more children. So
yeah, that's right.
So
well, Jeff,
I think there's some good stuff going on, and we have our work to do, but I think there's going to be even a more willing audience for it moving forward. So
I certainly agree with you there, and hope that we're right. Last question on our 6 Questions podcast is always, who is your favorite founding father and why?
Oh, wow. Well, I love John Adams, of course, but I'm not going to go there, because that's just that would be, I've always really, really liked, admired John Dickinson, Pennsylvania, Delaware. Spent a lot of time in Pennsylvania and Delaware, been in his house. He is an extraordinary thinker. He was a huge titan of that period, that very post 7 Years War period, that early colonial period, into right up to the Constitution. He's one of the main few people that has gone basically from the Stamp Act crisis to the Constitutional Convention and beyond. And he was an incredible, well, he's very neglected now, but he was very influential, was a statesman, a thinker, very important, deep. He wrote a very important pamphlet that is only rivaled by Paine's Common Sense, called the Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. And it was written in, I think, 1760s. It was around 1767. It was around the Townshend Acts, where he laid out for the first time. He was like yourself. He was a legal scholar. He was a deep legal scholar. Went to the Inns Court in England as a young man when they were just starting to do that. Was the most legally erudite, arguably, member of the founding generation. An incredible figure. And he made the legal case for the first time for basically separation from the colonies in those letters. Now, he wasn't advocating at the time pure separation, but he was advocating through very close legal reasoning that the Stamp Act taxes and the Townshend Acts were an innovation of British, and as such, the colonies had the right to reject them and to sort of fight back. Well, that was read. Everyone read it in Europe. Everyone in the college. It started a whole movement and traced out the history of the colonial complaints against the British for the first time. It was made. Now, why is he not known? You're asking. I know you're asking, Trent. You're in your mind. Right. Why? It sounds so great, so interesting, so important. Yes, he was. Why? Don't we know him better? Because he did not vote for the Declaration of Independence. He was there. He wasn't against separation. He was for it, like everybody there at that meeting was. But he represented a position that it was immoderate to do it at that time, because they didn't have the French lined up. And he said, hey, we need the French behind us. We're going to get wiped out. I mean, the potential for this to be a bloodbath, to be a rupture. He wanted greater assurance that the French, that they could get this done and get it done right. And he made a very famous argument at the time. Only a few held it, but he was known as the penman of the revolution. He wrote most of the documents of the time. Had he not taken that nuanced position on the Declaration of Independence, probably would have been the writer of the Declaration of Independence, not Jefferson. Everybody knew Dickinson in that way. He's been called the American Burke. Hey, that's American Burke. That's good enough for me as a favorite founder. He's a complicated guy, but it does show how nuanced there's not just a monolithic founding, right? It's just not 5 guys and fries, at the founding. There was some other guys with some other stuff bringing to the table. And Dickens is a monster intellectual and a really interesting guy. I think he wrote I know I'm going too long here, but I got excited. You got me excited about John Dickinson.
No, it's great.
A lot of people don't get excited
guest.
about it, but he wrote at the time to his friends. I know all my fame, everything I had gotten up to this point, people's admiration. I know it's chucked out the window by doing this. The posterity is going to look down on me, but I'm going to do it anyway because this is what I believe, and it's about principle. That's a good guy.
You're the first guest who's mentioned John Dickinson. I think that's
really?
great.
Oh, well, good. Well, hey, go out there and read John Dickinson, people. There's a great book, ISI book, published it back. It's a very nice little book by William Murchison. I think it's called The Cost of Liberty. It's a very nice, easy volume. Very interesting guy.
Yeah.
And a real conservative.
That's right. And it is a great book. I was hoping you were going to mention that because I couldn't remember what the title was, but no, it's also over there.
Good.
On the shelf.
You got a good library.
So
the founders would approve.
That's I mean, ISI certainly has been one of the best sources for conservative books across my entire lifetime. So I'm very, very thankful for your work there. Very thankful, Jeff Nelson, for your work at the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. How can people find out more about what you do? Maybe connect students with the Kirk Center. How do they get in touch?
Well, the best way for all of us is on our website, which is kirkcenter.org, just kirkcenter.org, not Russell Kirk, just Kirk Center. And there you'll find a pretty clear outline of our programs for students and for high school teachers. We talked about that. We have students, a high school teen program. We also have an online book review journal, the University Bookman, which publishes every week several book reviews online. And you can if you want great conservative writers today writing about conservative books and ideas and all kinds of things, including non-political things, some culture, the arts, and some of the things you were talking about earlier, novels. So you'll find stuff there that you might not find anywhere. But anyway, there's lots. Hopefully you find something that will interest you with the Kirk Center, and of course read Dr. Kirk's writings. They always repay.
Jeff, thank you so much for being a part of our 6 Questions podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me.
And thanks to all of you for watching, for listening. We will be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, please stay in touch with us through Facebook, Twitter, wherever you are on social media. The power of Save Our States and what we do is the power of you out there contacting your state legislators, spreading the word about the importance of the Electoral College, our nation of states, this constitutional order that Jeff and I have been talking about. And remember to go and visit kirkcenter.org. Until next time, I'm Trent England for Save Our States.